at Yale University, PhD from MIT. He has created a very influential research center based at Yale, Innovations for Poverty Action. He is, and all the affiliates within the center are also doing cutting-edge research in the areas of development economics, obviously, but particularly finance, microfinance, using methodologies, mainly randomized controlled trials. So it is a big honor for us that he accepted our invitation to be here today, and so we're looking forward to hearing. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of the inaugural conference of this NOVAFRICA Center. So it's very exciting, all the energy and work that I see that is coming about here, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this opening ceremony of the conference. So I'm going to give a kind of two parts to this talk. The first part is going to be a little bit more general, talking about an overall process and way of thinking about using research to help influence and solve policy problems. And the second will be, I'll then dig into a little bit of detail on a couple of projects, one in particular, which will give you a little bit more of a little more concreteness about how this actually plays out in a particular project that's in the rainfall insurance. So when I teach, I've thought about doing the following. I haven't actually done this, but I maybe will at some point, which is to not give any questions on my final exam, except one, which is to say, give me 3 questions. And then give them a context and say, now go into the questions of this context. Okay, and if they don't get that, if they cannot give me the following 3 questions I'm about to show you, then they fail the course. Because every lecture I give opens up with these 3 questions. What is the market failure? Does X solve it? And what is the welfare gain? Right? Now there's sub-questions and there's nuances to these questions. It's not always quite that simple, right? So when we ask what is the market failure, we want to know not just what is it, but why is it, what's the actual mechanism that's going on. Part of it is also a first order question there about does it actually exist? Is there a market failure? The second, does X solve the market failure? We want to know something about why. Why is it solving it? How is it going about doing this? And then it's those why questions which help you learn grander lessons that can be taken elsewhere. The third is really the impact question. It's the welfare gain. Okay, so we have scarce resources. We have to choose. We have lots of problems in the world. We can't solve them all. We might have some clear ideas about how to solve some. Which one do we solve? So we want to know how much bang do we get for our buck for addressing these different problems. And so that's what the third question, what is the welfare gain, really getting at. Okay, so I'm going to apply this to cows for just a moment. Give you an example of kind of this, how this way of thinking can help guide us. So cows are somewhat of a puzzle, I think. So 45% of Indian households own at least one cow or one buffalo. We went through an accounting exercise. We got the best data we could come up with. It was a really in-depth survey that went through every single thing you could ask about a cow. And we imputed labor at market wages in these communities through a different survey that asked about what the wages were in the community for doing housework and working in someone else's land and things like this. When we figure out, we just think about it like an accountant. Suppose you're in business school and you just put a spreadsheet together. We're not asking kind of a deep counterfactual question. We're just asking an accounting exercise. Put out a spreadsheet, show me the inflows, show me the outflows. What's your return on investment if you were going to invest in one of these cows? Turkey cows were negative 64%. Buffaloes did a lot better. There you only lost 40%. Right? Now when we impute household labor at 0, literally 0, then that's when we start getting the positive numbers. So think about that as the upper bound, right? What's the true market wage for labor? That's the big unknown. So what we're getting, if we think the upper bound is the market wage and the lower bound is 0, then the range of possible returns goes from 6% to negative 64. Okay, so this is something's wrong here. So this reminds me of, have you guys familiar with the website The Onion? Okay, so this is one of my favorite headlines from The Onion. That picture right there is something, this really crazy thing we have in America, or one of the crazy things we have in America, called edible arrangements. You guys ever heard of this?
Arrangements.
Has anybody ever here bought anything from edible arrangements? Okay, good. Because if someone had, I would have to apologize to you right now as I proceed it, because it's going to be very insulting. So it's basically, this is what they sell. They sell these like arrangements that have fruit that's going to go bad unless it's all eaten very quickly, because it's all cut up, the fruit. Right? So it's it's not even like a fruit basket where it's the skin, so this fruit can stay good for a few days. It's all cut up. It's just, except for the grapes. I mean, it's silly. Right? So here's the headline. The continued existence of edible arrangements disproves central tenets of capitalism. Right? And the basic argument that they make in this article is one of two things is wrong. Either our basic idea that markets work, and by that we mean profitable firms get competed away so that profits go away, and unprofitable firms go out of business, thus bringing profits in the industry back to zero. Right? Something's wrong with that fundamental theory, because here's a business which, if people are rational, cannot possibly be making any money, and yet it persists and continues to exist. So something's wrong with our theory of entry and exit in markets, and there's some sort of market failure, market friction that is not allowing people to move capital from one industry to another, away from unprofitable things into profitable things. Or the second tenet is wrong, which is that people are rational, and then maybe this thing actually is making money because there's enough idiots in the world that go around buying stuff. Okay, so that's the basic thing, and we've now just replaced edible arrangements with caps. Right, and so that's the puzzle we're working on, and that's actually the title of a draft paper we have called says "Continued Existence of Cows Disproves Central Tenets of Capitalism." Now, obviously, I don't really believe this, right? I mean, I don't. Just to be clear, I mean, this is the title, the satire, the article, the research paper is real, but something's wrong, right? It cannot. Those numbers I just showed you cannot be right. Something is happening that this market is out of whack and these numbers are wrong. So where's the market failure? Well, the first could just be that our data are wrong. Right? So we start off with this puzzle of just, market's not working in some respect. And now let's figure out why. So the first is just the simplest. Right? Maybe we're just totally underestimating revenues, we're totally overestimating costs, and we've cross-checked things off of other sources. We've done what we could, we report where we think we may be noisier than others, but at the end of the day, we do think our numbers are right. And then we go through a list of other options. Each of these options, if it's right, if that's the source of the problem, should and could lead to a market intervention that one might want to think about that would actually have some sort of welfare gain. So, preference for own produced milk. Why might you prefer your own produced milk? Right, so this would mean that our revenue numbers are out of whack because you don't really have flexibility to just sell and buy at the same price. But there's like this huge preference for the own produced milk. Now I don't think it's a taste thing, right? So presumably. This story basically is based on the idea that there might be a contamination problem. Right? You trust your own cow's milk because you control the flow and it's your bucket. But you go to the market, you buy milk from somewhere else and you don't know what you're getting. Right? But this says that there's a missing market here that has not been filled, which is about third-party verification on quality. Right? And there are some movements, some things in this zone that do things like this, but not good enough. So that's one idea. I'm not just so you know where this is going. I'm not going to have an inch point. Right? I'm just explaining the thought process and some our leading hypothesis. A preference for illiquid savings. Right? That just says that there's another benefit to this cow. That the numbers are right, but we weren't including this whole other benefit that's there, which is that the cow is also an illiquid form of savings, and they prefer that over cash in their mattress, which doesn't lose 40%, because cash in the mattress might lose even more on frivolous consumption items that they don't really want, or that they're forced to consume, forced to give away to family and friends who claim the money from them. Right? And so 40% is a loss on the cow, but it's better than the loss they would get if they kept the cash, because then they would get them. Right? So that just says, that's okay, we've had a huge problem in the savings market here. What's going on that a 40% loss on your savings is actually deemed a good thing and better than the next best alternative. Right? I mean, how do we get people just 0% interest rate savings accounts then? Would be clearly improvement over this. The true value of labor is 0. Maybe that really is the opportunity cost of time. And that says that there's something, clearly there's something wrong with labor markets and those labor market failures, which have nothing to do with cows. They're then manifesting themselves in this cow market. Speculative motive to buy cows. So maybe this is, think about this as a behavioral failure, right? There's just over-optimism. There's maybe kind of a over-optimism in terms of the right tail distribution for how much money they're going to get to make. Or preference for positive students in return. Similar idea here. Additional services to the household. This just says that this is fits under the category maybe our data aren't right. That there's other benefits that we're just not capturing. Particularly for the buffaloes, if they're doing any work like on the fields. Although we don't see much evidence on that, we do try to monitor it. We don't think that's right. And lastly, this one was added actually after getting a comment. So maybe it's just a preference for worshiping cows. We all know that cows are safe in India. The fact is, though, we can come up with our examples, right? This is not, the cows are not some sort of weird outlier in the world. And when we go to Zambia or the Philippines, there's no corollary. There's no similar analogous enterprise where when we dig into the cash flows, we're stuck scratching our head going, I don't get it, where's the money? This is consistent. It's just that cows are just so dominant in India that it was and because of the lumpiness of the investment, it was easier for us to get our head around thinking about the accounting. So this is just a way of explaining the overall way of thinking. Right? We start off with this puzzle, and we want to understand what is driving what seems to be a problem. There seems to be some fundamental flaw here. Now let's try to figure out where is the problem. Is it a persuasion problem? Is it a behavioral problem? Is it an interlinking market problem where there's some market failure in some other market that is then driving a wedge into this market? But what's the source of the problem? And then with each of those problems, we can think about what might be solutions to those problems, and then likewise we can think about how to solve those problems. Okay, so then methodologically, what do we do to solve these? To try to get at these, and this is a lot of what when I started in graduate school, what I was struck by more than anything was how few answers we had where we were presented work in a class that was basically trying to understand the causal link from some policy to some outcome, and how rare it was that we were able to take a result and not just have immediate first order selection bias type problems. We can have it with our ability to kind of believe it and be convinced by it. And this is right in the early days of when experiments started getting big, right? And we saw that there's kind of at least what I've seen is two worlds kind of come together. Right? We had a world of development economists who were mostly interested in understanding the answer to substantive questions about policy and where there's a clean identification of counterfactual. We also saw another world, which were lab experimental work people, who were questioning the external validity of lab experiments and saying, maybe these tools can be used to answer similar questions in the field. And so we've now seen a little bit of the merging of these two worlds that initially kind of started off in totally different kind of spheres and conversations. Both of these are fundamentally driven by the recognition that randomization is great for getting internal validity. One of the common things that we often find ourselves in conversations about when we come about experiments is conversations about external validity. One of the most common, I think, misunderstandings of experiments is this idea that that external validity is a problem for experiments. That is a poorly phrased statement. It is true, but it is misleading. External validity is a problem for research. Period. For all research. It's always a question we should be asking. How can we use this to go somewhere else and take this idea, right? It's not, and experiments do not neither improve nor worsen the external validity of the lessons from any one set. Right? So what do we need in order to go and tackle policy questions? We need to be able to have some theory, some understanding as to why something is working. With that, should naturally flow out some predictions about the contextual factors which are important for something to work. A really well-designed experiment also thinks about these things in advance and tackles the external validity partly in its design. Right? So what do I mean by this is, suppose that there's some intervention about social learning. And you could set up an experiment and you could see that you do something with some friends and then other friends do it too. But if you want to know something more about why this is working, to be able to do something else, you might want to know, did people do this when their friends did it because they were just mimicking them? Or did they do it because they were learning from it? Two very different things. Right? And so if we go into a totally other context, and we find that everybody already knows about something, well then the learning's not going to matter. Everybody already knows about it. But the mimicry might. So if we learned in our first setup that it turns out that the reason why social contagion effects occur is all about learning. When we go somewhere else, we then know some diagnostics that we can apply, and then if it's the case that everybody in that society already knows about this thing, then it tells us that the social contagion effect won't happen, if that's just briefly that. I'll just give you an example of why you need to, how knowing something about why something is working helps you go into another setting, and then with some diagnostics learning. Okay, so this is just a long-winded way of saying external validity is tackled with theory and data on mechanisms and design of the research to help try to get at the why question. Right? But the experiment itself, the fact that you have some randomization making it so that some people are more likely to get something than another, or people are getting something different, does not actually hurt nor help the external validity. The other thing which randomization does not get us instinctively, although I think more work needs to be done on this, has to do with standards, consistency, and transparency. There's a lot of problems right now in this space where it's like I think we're all learning about some important issues that need to be dealt with. Data mining is something which I think is we're particularly aware of with experiments because it's not the case of a data set that's sitting up online where a million people can download it and run a million tests. Right? But we're actually behaving more like scientists, where if you're going to have a pharmaceutical scientist in terms of letting medical science, people who run randomized trials for medicine. If you're going to run a randomized trial for a pharmaceutical drug, you would have to pre-specify, I am testing this on children, adults, men, women, people with the following symptoms, prior or not. And then if it worked, you would have, first of all, your analysis would only be restricted to that which you said you were going to analyze. And your results could only be used in that setting too. Even if after the fact you dreamt up some theory and you had some awareness that it turns out there's nothing about gender that matters for this thing. So even though I tested it on men, I should be able to use it for women. But you wouldn't be allowed to in the pharmaceutical world. I'm not saying we should go to that exchange, but I think there's a lot that needs to get thought through in terms of these issues. But theory mining has a similar problem. One unfortunate reality is we're all rewarded in economics for writing papers which have theory and then tests of theory. And if you just go and you just do a test, and you don't have a grand theory that you're claiming to test, it makes it harder to get published. The problem is this also encourages theory mining. I'm going to go run a million tests, I'm going to figure out what I found, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to figure out what theory I just found, and now I'm going to write a paper as if I had this theory all along, and now I'm going to have the test for my beautiful theory, which I just discovered. And this is, just as much of a problem. So, and I think we need to figure our social norms are developing in these types of standards. Unpublished null results. This happens to be personally one of my pet peeves. Javi right here is my co-author. I'm about to show you a line from a referee report we got once, which said the following. He refused to let me go to battle with the editor on this one. He was trying to save his political capital for the future. I still haven't promised to never write the editor, but here's this literal statement we got in a referee report, and this is just absolute blasphemy, and this type of thing needs to be shut out from our profession. The central difficulty, this is basically a paper which has a lot of theory that people have written about group versus individual liability in lending markets, where a lot of theory is saying that group liability is going to be better than individual liability for getting money back. Right? Some theory goes over. But most of the theory says one. The point is there's lots of theory arguing about this. And we did a test, and we got a really precise 0. We got no difference. We set up this test, and it's precisely estimated. Okay, so if someone shows you a null result on a paper that has turns out A does not cause B, and A was the length of my hair, and B was who was going to win the World Cup, right? Then I would agree that this is a stupid question to ask, and a null result is uninteresting. Right? But in something where you have an interesting question and precisely estimated 0, our profession needs to reward this. But I've seen it too as an editor. I've gotten referee reports on null result papers where people say, not sure what to do about this, it's a null result. But we're going to ignore that and march ahead. But here's the quote: the essential difficulty of which the authors are well aware, very clear in this is that almost all of the findings of the paper are negative results. The main message of the paper is that individual and group lending appear to have very similar outcomes. This raises the question of whether a collection of no results can together constitute a compelling paper. The authors argue that they estimate this null result with precision, but it is still fundamentally, I love that word, a negative finding. Okay? So, if we're going to take ourselves seriously as scientists, setting up, pre-specified tests where we take important questions and we test them, and then we want to see the results and we want those results shared, we need a process in our profession that does not dismiss null results. Right? It's not just, this problem exists in other fields too. It's not just a problem in economics. But to the extent that we're now setting up our norms, and in terms of what we expect of our fellow peers, this is one that we can work to get straight now. Okay. I'm going to talk about our need for application more later, but I'm going to keep going. So limitations. There are some important areas where experimentation is not good. 3 in particular: too early, too late, too small. Too early, tinkering phase. You're working with some really cool innovation, some cool project, very cutting edge, creative technology maybe it's about the business structure and the way people are going to be interacting that you haven't figured out yet. And it's just too early, and they're tinkering around, and every month they're kind of changing how they're doing things. Is it too early? Right? It's not to say it's too early for research. Maybe it would be helpful to document something about the learning process. That's not things that economists typically write about, but it's still good research that can be that the world can learn from about how that innovation process unfolds. But it's too early to set up experiments if you're still figuring out what the actual function is. Too late. Too late is if it's already done, right? Or the money's already allocated, and you're not gonna. There's no scarce resource, right? Most of the time, it's scarce. So I can honestly tell you, I don't think I've ever personally been in this. I've been in the too early situation. I've actually launched projects too early too. I've done things where after the background, so I've got G-shots. I shouldn't have done that. It was too early. I've never been in the too late situation where, in the sense that the money was spent and there was no further spending that was going to happen, right? And so it was just one of these things where all that the research would be used for is to look backwards and say, how did we do it? And if that were the case, then it would be a waste, right? You want research to guide you in the future, not just like tools for accountability. Third, too small. So too small, meaning that I think I meant too large. Well, it depends on, I guess, what I mean. What I'm saying here is when the sample size is too small, which also is another way of saying that is the unit in which you're offering your service or changing your policy is too big. Right? So if it's, take it to the very extreme, right? Macroeconomic policy is not something that one can set up a field experiment on. Similarly, if you're doing things at the market level, this also has serious implications. So there have been some really interesting interventions lately, and good research has come out of it about market prices, information about market prices, and how this changes agricultural behavior. Fishermen in India was the first paper in this spirit that had a huge impact. That's a tough one to randomize because you can't, the whole idea is that markets are linked. And so if the whole point is that there's spatial heterogeneity in prices, And with better market information, you no longer see that spatial heterogeneity. Right? So that's a before-after statement. The only counterfactual you could have would be like some other commodities, some other countries, things of this nature. That's probably going to be too big of a scale to be able to set up such a. Okay. So those are the big picture thoughts. How long? I know. What should I go with?
15, 20 minutes, and then we'll talk about
Okay. So I'm going to whip through this part a little bit faster, and I want to just give you a concrete example of one of my favorite projects that we're working on now. So in the broad scheme, in lessons in finance, one of the things that is striking is about 40 years ago, we saw finance mainly as an intervention done by government, with loans to farmers, with balloon payments, with individual liability. And then in kind of one fell swoop, we saw all of this change with Mohammed Yunus's leadership of the Green Bank, and then it's sprouted elsewhere as well. We saw government shift to NGO, switch to for-profits. We saw, instead of farmers, a focus on micro-entrepreneurs. Instead of balloon payments, we see a focus on high-frequency prepayments. Instead of individual liability, we saw a shift to group liability. Now we're seeing a shift back to individual liability or to group lending. So group lending as distinct liability means, and this is what John and I were testing, which means it's a group that is all, they're all borrowing together, but they're not actually liable for trade loans. And loans have stayed loans. And that's the point I'm going to be talking about. Why loans stay loans? Why have we not seen more innovation outside of lending? And we are starting to now is part of the answer, but it's certainly at its infancy compared to the lending markets. So we're seeing a big push on savings markets, and figuring out how to reduce transaction costs, and also, in some cases, how to increase transaction costs in the form of commitment savings accounts. And microinsurance is the project I'm going to tell you more about. And then the third, something that we're now starting to see a lot of, particularly as many of you know in Africa, we're seeing an entire leap over landlines right to cell phones, and with that, mobile money has taken off faster in parts of Africa, particularly Kenya, than in the developed world. Okay, so to get at the microcredit question. And this is one of the reasons why we're seeing this push towards some of the other aspects of microfinance. There's been a lot of disappointment, I think is the best way of putting it. And it's disappointment because some of the hope was so high for what the impact was going to be, that when the reality came out, it didn't quite live up to everybody's, or the high end of the hopes and dreams. There were some other people that really hoped it would fail, and they also were kind of upset. Because it didn't show total miserable failure and collapse of debt cycles. So there's two basic approaches that we've seen, that we're seeing now in terms of using experimental methods to get at the question of what is the impact of an expansion of access to credit. One thing that is I think hopefully to be clear, and this actually is that no study has ever tackled the question of what's the impact of access to making or access to credit. Because it's not possible in this world to take people from zero to something. Everybody has some access. So the only thing that we're ever testing in these things is about the impact of expanding access and doing something to get people to use more credit and then asking the question of what's the causal link from there. So the two basic approaches, one is a marginal application randomization process or credit scoring technique. So we started this in South Africa on a consumer lender. We also then did it in the Philippines, and now there's a new paper done that was recently out by other researchers from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we have a new one from the Philippines. And this basically says it's working with a bank, and we're actually in this context we're actually almost like consultants. We're offering the following deal to banks. We're saying we'll show you how to do credit scoring if you randomize them mobile. So you take the ones that, where you just don't know what the credit worthiness is because the data just aren't that good. You tell us how much capital you're willing to put at risk in that tranche. And rather than draw some arbitrary line, we're going to take a middle band and we're going to randomize. And that's how we design the study. The second set of studies are randomized program placement. And these are done by basically marking off geographic areas. And if it's in a rural area, it's very easy and obvious. It's villages. If it's more of an urban area, then it's a matter of dividing out like neighborhoods, and then the lender goes to something. The results, as I mentioned, have consistently shown that when these banks expand, they actually do expand access to credit, right? It is, the first stage is actually an important first stage to think about. That they're not merely replacing one debt with another debt, but there's actually an increased flow of capital. We do see some business starts and investments go up. The biggest impact we typically see is that people are better at managing risk. And I think the most important thing that we're starting to tackle now, the newest one, which we're going to have out soon, is from an evaluation in Mexico from Barcomos. It's titled Win Some and Lose Some. And the point here is really looking much harder at heterogeneity in terms of are there people that are using the money in ways that that lead to bad outcomes for themselves and others that are looking at it. Okay, but the risk is really is a big outcome that we can see fairly consistently, and there's other evidence too from before the experiments that talks a lot about using credit as as an insurance tool. Chris Udry's dissertation, for instance, from about 20 years ago was a highly influential paper for documenting this very clearly, showing that loans were really more or less used as insurance products. So this is part of what got us really excited thinking about insurance. And in particular, there was, think about, the reasons why you want insurance. There's, first of all, the obvious, which is just to have higher levels of consumption in bad times when you have a bad shock. But there's a different idea, which is also often thought to be one of the key drivers or hindrances for growth and investment, which is that you're not making investments because of the riskiness of whatever the enterprise, whatever the activity is that you could be doing, right? And likewise, if you're a bank, the irony is if you're not having your loans accepted by people because they're concerned about the ability to repay a loan, right, which is often reported to us. That banks wish they could make loans, but the people don't want to borrow because they're really concerned about the rainfall and not being able to pay a loan. So this is a puzzle, right? There's clearly a market failure going on when that's happening, right? That we should be thinking about, because what this says is that that's like the dream client. If I'm the banker, I want to figure out exactly who that person is, and I want to lend to that person, because that person is so trustworthy that they're not willing to borrow from me in the first place. Right? I should be perfectly happy as the bank to absorb that rainfall risk. Right? And I've actually managed to identify someone who is so trustworthy, so I don't have to worry about moral hazard that's choice. Right? I just have to worry about rainfall risk. So this is clear signs of there being a market failure, and this is one of the reasons for thinking about rainfall insurance. Rainfall insurance, in particular, reason for it goes back to thinking about what are the market failures that drive insurance market problems, and adverse selection, moral hazard are screaming out at you. Crop insurance has, as far as I'm aware, no real successful anecdotes of systematic crop insurance in developing countries that has succeeded, that is not just continuously subsidized by the government, basically. Right? And the idea there is you just have really obvious adverse selection and moral hazard problems if you're insuring the actual yield of the plot. Right? And so the idea with rainfall insurance is let's insure against an index that does not have either constituents. Okay. So this is work with Isaac Osai, Robert Osai, and Chris Udry from northern Ghana, where we set up an experiment to basically try to answer this question about does investment go up when we take away a risk. Likewise, we also want to know about capital constraints. Or if we relax credit constraints, liquidity constraints, not liquidity constraints, let's call it, will that lead to higher investment? And it's not so easy to compare the two because there's not a market. So we did both, but it's a little hard to actually compare the points. We also, this has been a labor of love, this project. It's been going on for about 4 years now. So we also have a whole long series of tests on price. I'm going to skip this. So here's the policy in the first year paid out for both drought and floods. In the following years, it just paid out for drought. This is our favorite photo. This is one of our employees at Innovations for Poverty Action, and that's a bag of money on his head. So this is how you build trust. So one of the biggest issues in rainfall insurance, we believe, has to do with trust. If people don't trust that you're going to pay out, they're not willing to buy it, and if you give it away to them for free, it also doesn't matter, because if they don't believe they're going to get the payout, they're not going to change their behavior. Right? So it doesn't matter for increasing investment if they don't trust that it's going to happen. So this is him making a panic in the middle of the flood. Now you might ask, what good was all that money on the other side of that flood? If you're like in this village, it's shut off from everything. But it's more about where the direction he was coming from. He had to go that way. Because I did ask this question. There was markets for them to get to, but it would have required for him going. It was easier. So what do we find? This is not obviously the detailed presentation of everything. But our basic experiment has people getting insurance for free, people getting money for free, we just gave them money to see what they would do, people getting both, and then a control group. And what we see here is this is CDF, the total costs for insurance, capital. Does that work? Okay. The top left is total for the insurance, the right is capital, and then the bottom is both. And basically what you can see here is that when you get insurance, you shift to the right your investments across the whole spectrum in terms of the whole distribution shifts right. When you get capital, we see a shift at the very left, right? In the very left part. So people, they tend to think what's happening there is that there is a sign that there are some capital constraints for those who are not investing much at all. But once they're above a certain level, there was no capital constraints. So this could just be a matter of wealth, showing that wealth is actually not, it is a correlate of liquidity constraints, and the poor are and the rich are not. No one's rich in the sandwich. And then when you get both, it looks exactly like the insurance. There's very little additive effect. When we look at that broken down by chemicals, we see the same exact pattern. It's a little bit exacerbated, but it's the same basic pattern. So this is fertilizer. That was actually the driving, there was one thing that we're really looking at in detail was fertilizer use. So that's like the first thing that people talk about, that there's underuse of fertilizer, and it's a big puzzle why. Farmers know it works, they know it increases their yield, they don't use it. Why? And the next one was the cultivated acres. So there's a lot of fallow land that literally lies around because they don't have the money to plant. So it costs us when they get more acres. It's just in terms of the actual, like there's no rental price, they just go to the cheap and get it. It does cost money though in terms of labor and in terms of fertilizer and inputs they could put in. And so we see the same exact pattern. And in terms of value, it follows. You put more inputs in, you get more value out. It turns out they don't actually make more money. So the one sad result, but we do see everything else get better. The demand curve here is also strikingly steep. Or at least we were surprised by how steep it was. We take it all the way from market prices, which is the 14 and the 12, all the way down to a price of 0. And we have tests all along the way. And so there's no time to kind of go into more detail, but there's a lot of interesting things to think about in terms of what this implies for how to develop the market. So then on the social learning, so here's, I think, one of the most important things for us to think about is how can we actually get a market like this going? Will social contagion effects help or hurt? And here's a case where it all depends, is the answer. Depends on whether there are payouts. This really reinforces the idea that trust is a big part of the problem. So basically what we find is that reading? No, okay. I just can't read it up here. You guys can read it here. So here's the way to read this table is the top row is telling us we're breaking out the social learning effect and your own learning effect for whether or not you happen to be in an area that got paid out or did not. And what we see is, and this is then predicting your willingness to buy insurance the next year. So what we see is in the top row, if you were insured and you got a payout, so you were in a bad rainfall area, then you're much more likely to buy the insurance the next year. And if you're one without a payout, hence you had a good outcome in your farm, you're much less likely to buy the insurance. So the first result is really good, makes us happy. The second result scares the crap out of us because it says this is a hard way of developing a market, that the insurance company, if they end up with a good year, hence make no payouts, this destroys their demand in the following year. The social network spillover is then in these, the fourth and fifth rows, and we see the positive learning takes place through the social network. So the social network share that's insured with a payout, huge learning that takes place. So if your friends get paid out, you're more likely to buy. If your friends do not get paid out, this is good. We're happy about a 0 there. This means that you don't learn anything if your friends don't get paid out. So there's no negative spillover that's taking place in the social premiums. That's more optimistic. So the basic lesson we learned from all of this is that risk management. And we're seeing actually other research. Javi has a paper from India that has a similar result, where rainfall insurance is leading to higher investment. We're seeing actually shockingly more consistent results at the microinsurance studies than we are from the microcredit studies in terms of it seeing that there's a clear link to increased investments by just removing risk for people. So, the issue about, so I go to traits, or,
Yes.
okay. So the second area that I was going to mention, much less details, on the savings side. And this is another area within microfinance that we're seeing a huge push, partly in response to the recognition that the credit is not kind of holding up to all of its promises. But the second is also more of an incorporation of ideas from behavioral economics and thinking about how we're actually designing products for the poor. So for everyone, but in particular, we're concerned with products for the poor. So the first study that we did on this was in the Philippines, where we set up a commitment savings account that had a very simple rule. Put money into the account, and you do not get to withdraw the money until you reach your goal. Right? It was imprecise in terms of its ability to match exactly to what is it that people were committing to. But it was very simple. So it's always a trade-off when you're designing things of this nature between simplicity and kind of precision of getting to a particular theory. But the most important thing to note here is that there was no premium paid for this liquidity. Right? Someone who was purely, kind of a traditionally neoclassical rational person would never want such a thing. Right? It merely restricts their future choices and provides no further benefit whatsoever, other than not giving them the option to withdraw their money. So we saw 28% of people who were offered this account open it up. We also found in our baseline survey that people who were more time inconsistent in the way they answered some very simple time preference questions were more likely to open up these accounts. Right? And so the idea being that people who are time inconsistent, if they're sophisticated and self-aware, will have a preference to remove future choices from themselves. And likewise, that's exactly what we found. Those are the people that say, yes, actually, this sounds good. I'd like to spend money away from myself and commit to it. So we saw an 80% increase on the intent to treat for those offered the account, which is a 330% increase for those who opened the account. After 2.5 years, the bank did nothing to keep it going. They just let the account sit, and people used them but dribbled away. So there was still an increase, but it was much smaller at the end of 2.5 years. It should be. I mean, there should be some pulling the money out to actually use it for things and things of this nature, but they never remarketed it to keep it going. It did lead to more power for women in the household, so they were more able to use the money for household purchases, for instance, compared to non-household purchases. So there's a lot of big open questions, though, in this space of savings product design, specifically about commitment savings. How do people self-sort into commitment accounts? How strong of a commitment is good? Do we want the absolute strongest, is where you're locked into consumption on a particular good? Weakest would simply be a mere statement to oneself. I'm going to save for something. That's a commitment device. There's now a cost to deviating. It's a psychic cost. It's one of personal pride at most, but it's there. Right? It's weak. It's the question of how much bang can you get from that. So we tried that actually. It was actually the most money I've ever spent on a project relative to what we actually did. Right? And I remember being very concerned when I first went to the donor who funded it, that they were going to laugh and said, "You want to spend how much money to test that?" And all we did is label the account. That's it. We had a fairly big study with several thousand people, where half of them everybody had a bank account, and then half of them were given a second bank account that had a name on it. And that was it. It was the entire intervention. The savings was up 30%. So, just from that alone, we're seeing that. We're now in the field to try to find out, do they actually spend more money on whatever that named thing was? So, because we know in our control group what they were saving for. So we can compare expenditures. We'll see what happens. Commitment to deposit versus commitment to not withdraw. Two very different things. Right? Where is it that the weakness occurs that you see the time inconsistent behavior happening? Is it at moments in which you are flush with cash and you need to save some, or is it moments in which you're faced with consumption decisions and so you need to not consume? So understanding more about how the time inconsistency actually plays out on a daily basis in someone's life that leads them to not achieve the things they want to achieve in terms of their financial behavior is important, that we actually get inside that box a little more, and it would actually lead to clear prescriptions on how to actually set up better accounts. Willingness to pay for a commitment. This is important for thinking about market solutions, market approach here. It does need to be something that is going to be profitable for banks. Luckily, making savings illiquid for a bank is usually a good thing. So for most banks, helping them figure out how to do commitment savings is the winning thing. Lastly, and I think this is one of the most unanswered questions for anybody who's working in the savings space. This is one of the toughest. It's one of the reasons why it's the most unanswered. I can tell you my own research does a really bad job of getting to this. And we need to see more on this. When you see, it's fine to be, I'm satisfied personally that seeing an increase in savings is a good thing, usually. But we should be thinking more about where that money is coming from. What is actually changing within the household? And just think about the mechanics. There's 4 options. Right? They could be getting higher income. So if the money was saved, invested, profits come out, goes back into savings. So all you're seeing is a snapshot every 6 months or every year. And maybe what you missed was, because you didn't have the video camera, was like the investments, profits, then deposits back in. And so you see this accumulating of savings that are the profits. In most settings in which we're dealing with, I don't think that's what's happening. Okay, but we should have it on the table so we can just think through the options. 2 is lower savings elsewhere. Well, I don't, it depends on what the other option is, right? Maybe it was actually better. What were the terms and conditions? Was it safer? Was it higher return? Was it lower transaction cost? What's the change? 3 is lower consumption. Well, now we're into a very uncomfortable space for us as economists. Right? If we're just talking about, they're spending less on Coca-Cola and they're buying more TVs, we're in a little bit of an uncomfortable space, about what we want to say or not say about welfare in that type of situation. Or, and this is the bad one, usually, higher debt. Right? Maybe we got them to save so much that they didn't have free cash flows, and when they needed money for something, they left the money in savings because they valued it irrationally, and then took out a high interest rate debt loan in order to buy something, or pay for school, or do something of that nature. And that's obviously a bad thing. So we need to think more about where the money's coming from and not treat savings as the end all. I'll skip that, and then so I was going to go back to just the methods. Points this closing. This is one of my favorite protest signs that was out about 2 years ago, I think, when I first saw this. And it was one of these marches in Washington, D.C. What do we want? Evidence-based decision making. When do we want it? After peer review. Okay, so that was my favorite protest sign for a while, but then I saw another one the other day, which I think is even funnier. Has absolutely nothing to do with economics, but once I put this one up, I couldn't resist. What do we want? Time travel. When do we want it? It's relevant. Okay, so closing thoughts. So ambition is overrated and underrated. So I think ambition is overrated in 2 senses. One is from a policy perspective. Anybody who thinks that they are going to solve the problems of the world or the country or whatnot, that's politics and that's rhetoric. We need to bring things back to earth a little bit when we're actually trying to make plans and be reasonable what we can accomplish. This is the problem we have in America that we're facing with our, the rhetoric we hear and the campaigns. Right? For researchers, though, I think there's an important lesson too, which is that there are some big brain questions out there, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be worked on. I mean, there are people who work on them. But we shouldn't be so engrossed in only asking the big questions that we then discredit the small questions, because the small questions can make big differences and are very answerable in our lifetimes. So I like the fact that there's also people that try tackling the big stuff, right? There's not a diss on that by any means. But it's a recognition that we can have grand debates about whether it's human capital or institutions that lead to growth and whatnot. And we can also go to the ground and say, well, look, we have a budget right now and we're going to spend $1 billion. What is the best way of spending the next $1 billion in this country to deal with a linked a school problem. And that's a question that is easier to get one's head around than actually setting up research to go and tackle. But ambition is underrated as well in some I think, some important domains. The first is about innovation. I see this in some sectors more so than others, but in the microfinance sector, innovation, I think, is underrated, undervalued. You see a lot of very conservative behavior, and part of this has to do with just a basic transformation problem in the market for development. Donors can diversify, but individual NGOs and politicians cannot. They're going all in on what they do, right? And so how do donors get the diversity they need when everybody, themselves is going to be rewarded for the binary kind of success failure type outcome? And so that's a general problem that we need to see more work and more effort from the donors and the policymakers to push the microfinance institutions and the banks to be more creative and innovative in terms of the types of products that they're offering. And the second is, I think we should be more ambitious in terms of our willingness and desire to set up replications in order to tackle questions of external building. That we can learn a lot from the one study in one place, but we can learn a lot more when similar things are done in multiple places in order to start testing under what context and what is the right theory to help understand why something is working. But to do that, one has to be ambitious about setting up long-term projects in multiple sites and not small little things that are kind of disconnected too much. So that's it. Thank you very much.